title of this tutorial is the Brachial Plexus, Part 2 of 2. My name is Carlos Andres Suarez-Quian, and I will be the narrator of this tutorial. This tutorial was produced while on sabbatical leave in the laboratory of Dr. Manuel Eugenio Dorado Ocaña, Associate Professor in the Department of Anatomy and Embryology at the University of Sevilla, Spain. This tutorial is solely for educational purposes and is not meant for reproduction, posting on the web, or to be used for commercial purposes. In the first tutorial of this two-part series, we discussed the location of the brachial plexus. The objective of the current tutorial is to discuss the formation of the brachial plexus itself. Let's begin. As you proceed with the current tutorial, it will become apparent that the nomenclature used to describe the brachial plexus is identical to that used to describe the components of a tree. Why is that? Contemplate Vesalius sitting under the shade of a tree 500 years ago after completing his dissection of nerves of the neck and axilla. In the guiding principles of the Renaissance, that man was part of the divine and nature, it is not too far-fetched for him to think how similar both the nature around us was similar to the nature within us. So, he came up with the naming of the parts of the brachial plexus with terminology familiar to him. Thus, we mention roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and finally branches, or nerves, as comprising the components of the brachial plexus. Students often ask, however, what are cords in trees? Perhaps you have spent a fall day splitting freshly cut wood, and if not, you should. It can be a relaxing way after a long day of studying anatomy. The cords represent the thickness of the tree that is ideal to split into firewood. Hence, the terms evolve that one would stack a cord of wood or purchase firewood by the cord. This is simply where the terms come from. And, as discussed in the previous tutorial and shown in this slide, the roots of the brachial plexus emerge as trunks in the posterior triangle of the neck, in between the anterior and intermediate scalene muscles. The network of nerves then continues into the axilla itself along with the axillary artery, as shown in this slide. Let's look at a schematic representation of the brachial plexus in space. As explained previously, the brachial plexus begins in the posterior triangle of the neck, then continues into the axilla, the space defined by the four-sided pyramid in the image. The plexus begins as roots that give rise to trunks. These divide into divisions, and the divisions form the cords, now within the space of the axilla. The cords then give rise to terminal branches. Let's continue with this scheme and go into the specific details of how the brachial plexus, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches form. The upper two roots of the brachial plexus, C5 and C6, come together to form the upper trunk. The C7 root continues by itself to form the middle trunk, and the lower two roots, C8 and T1, come together also to form the lower trunk. Understand that this is the most common situation. In certain cadavers, the C4 root will give a contribution to the upper trunk. The naming of the trunks is simply based on their topographical relationship. In this image of the sagittal cut made at the approximate location indicated by the image on the upper right hand of the slide, the trunks can be observed immediately after emerging into the posterior triangle of the neck, just above the first rib, lined up from top to bottom, and hence their name. Once formed, the trunks almost immediately divide. Each trunk will give rise to an anterior and a posterior division. All posterior divisions of the three trunks come together in a posterior direction. Meanwhile, the anterior divisions of the upper two trunks join up, whereas the anterior division of the lower trunk continues by itself. It is the divisions of the trunks that give rise to the chords of the brachial plexus in the axilla. Again, all three posterior divisions come together to give rise to the posterior chord. The anterior divisions from the upper two trunks come together to form the lateral chord, and the anterior division of the lower trunk continues by itself as the medial chord. The naming of the chords, whether lateral, medial, or posterior, is also done based on their topographical location, but now we use the axillary artery as a reference. Look at the image of the sagittal section in the slide, but now know that the cut was made more distally than the first cut. This time it includes the space of the axilla. The axillary artery serves as the reference point for the lateral, medial, and posterior chords. The chords will subsequently split into terminal branches, usually within the axilla, although students should be aware when dissecting their own cadavers that variations do exist and are frequent. The terminal branches of the lateral and medial chords are as follows. The lateral chord gives rise to the musculocutaneous nerve. The medial chord gives rise to the ulnar nerve. Both chords give a contribution to the median nerve. These contributions are often referred to as roots or divisions of the median nerve, which can be confusing to the beginning students. These divisions or roots do not refer to the previously mentioned roots or divisions. And now, I think it is clear that the terminal branches of the lateral and medial chords, the musculocutaneous, the median, and ulnar nerves, form an M in the axilla. Indeed, it is common to tell beginning students to first look for this M when performing a dissection of the brachial plexus in the axilla. Again, however, expect variations. In my dissecting career, I have often found very lopsided M's, or M's whose location is definitely within the arm itself, not the axilla, or M's that have extra contributing roots. Be aware that variations are common and come to expect them. Now that we have finished describing the formation of the backbone of the brachial plexus, let's fill in the name of the branches that we have previously left out. Let's start with the nerve branches that emerge from the roots of the brachial plexus. These include the long thoracic nerve from roots C5, C6, C7, the nerve to the subclavius, and the dorsal scapular nerve. From the trunks, there's only one nerve, the suprascapular nerve. From the lateral cord, we have the lateral pectoral nerve, the musculocutaneous, and the lateral root of the median nerve. From the medial cord, there are 5 terminal branches: the ulnar nerve, the medial root of the median nerve, the medial pectoral nerve, the medial cutaneous nerve of the forearm, and finally, the medial cutaneous nerve of the arm. We now look at the branches from the posterior cord. The 2 terminal branches are the axillary and the radial nerves. Next, we can see the upper subscapular, the thoracodorsal, and the lower subscapular nerves. Finally, here's a slide of the brachial plexus and all its terminal branches. You might have the questions of whether you need to know the names and locations of all these nerves. The simple answer is yes. It takes time, so make sure you give yourself plenty of time to learn these names and where the branches come from. Indeed, not only do you need to know all their names, but also what they do. Let's look now at the nerves as they appear in dissections. We look at the terminal nerves that emerge from the roots, and there are three: the long thoracic nerve, the nerve to the subclavius, and the dorsal scapular nerve. From the trunks, we know there's only one nerve that exits, the suprascapular nerve. From the posterior cord, we again see the nerves that emerge: the radial, the axillary, the lower subscapular, the thoracodorsal, and the upper subscapular. We next look at the terminal branches from the lateral and medial cords. From the lateral cord, we see the lateral pectoral nerve and the musculocutaneous nerve. From the medial cord, we see the medial pectoral nerve, ulnar nerve, medial cutaneous nerve of the arm, and the medial cutaneous nerve of the forearm. And finally, the median nerve receives contributions from both cords. So now we have looked at all the nerves of the brachial plexus, both in a schematic and in a real cadaveric dissection. There's a lot of information here, but now comes the fun part. You have to know what muscles these nerves innervate. Let's focus on this part of the brachial plexus now, and again, we will look at the nerves as they exit from the roots, trunks, and cords. From the roots, we have three nerves indicated in yellow text. What muscles do they innervate? The dorsal scapular does the rhomboid and levator scapulae muscles. The nerve to the subclavius does the subclavius muscle, and the long thoracic innervates the serratus anterior. From the trunk, we have the suprascapular nerve, and this innervates two muscles, the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus. From the lateral cord, we had three nerves to consider. The lateral pectoral nerve innervates the pectoralis major muscle. The musculocutaneous nerve does all the muscles of the anterior compartment of the arm, and the median nerve does most of the muscles of the anterior compartment of the forearm, the muscles that make up the thenar eminence of the hand, and the first two lumbricals. The nerves from the medial cord are responsible for controlling the following actions. The medial pectoral nerve innervates both the pectoralis minor and major. The ulnar nerve serves to innervate 1.5 muscles of the anterior compartment of the forearm, then innervates most of the muscles of the palm of the hand except those served by the median nerve. And finally, the medial cutaneous nerves of the arm and forearm are strictly sensory to these regions. The last set of nerves we need to consider are the nerves from the posterior cord. The radial nerve does all the muscles located in the posterior aspects of the arm and forearm. The axillary nerve innervates the deltoid and the teres minor. The lower subscapular does the teres major. The thoracodorsal does the latissimus dorsi, and the upper subscapular innervates the subscapularis. This now concludes the second part of this tutorial on the brachial plexus, and I am sure many of you may have a glazed look on your face as to whether all this information is relevant. Trust me, it is, and you will need to learn it in the weeks ahead. You will see it again and again as we describe each region of the upper limb and you learn the specific muscle names and their actions. And then you will come to understand the need to know both muscle action and nerve supply. Injuries to muscles are often injuries to nerves that innervate them. By knowing muscle action and their nerve regulation, it is possible to discern nerve lesions and or deficits after injuries in patients. This is how your anatomical knowledge will be assessed and come into practice. None of this work would have been possible without the generous gift of the donors. I remain humbled by their humane gift. Special thanks must go to Mr. Mark Savornia, who does the incredible work of embalming the cadavers. His skill is obvious in the images. Thank you. Finally, you can use your QR reader to look in Apple iBooks, where you will find flashcards, ID questions, and higher order problem-based questions relevant to this tutorial.